The wind doesn't just blow through the Appalachian Gaps, it breathes. It's a heavy, wet sound that rattles the rhododendrons and makes you feel like the mountains are closing their teeth around you. I grew up hearing the warnings. Don't look into the trees after dark. Don't whistle in the woods. And if you hear someone calling your name from the brush, know you didn't. I used to think it was just local flavor, a way to keep hikers from falling off a ridge or getting mauled by a stray black bear. But as I stood on the edge of the trailhead at 2 a.m., the beam of my flashlight swallowed by a fog so thick it felt like velvet, I realized those weren't warnings. They were instructions for survival. I stepped over the rusted iron gate, ignoring the cold knot tightening in my stomach, and walked straight into the mouth of a nightmare I should have seen coming. The silence of the Blue Ridge at night isn't peaceful. It's an active, predatory kind of quiet. My boots crunched against the dry dirt and shale, the sound echoing far too loudly against the steep rock faces that hemmed in the path. Every few yards I'd stop, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, convinced I'd heard a second set of footsteps echoing my own. But when I turned, there was only the gray wall of the mist and the skeletal silhouettes of stunted oaks. I checked my GPS, but the screen was a mess of digital static, the blue dot flickering erratically before the device simply died. I should have turned back then. I should have let the darkness win. Instead, I tightened the straps of my pack and pushed deeper into the shadows, driven by a stubborn, stupid brand of curiosity that only the young and the doomed possess. About 3 miles in, the temperature plummeted. It wasn't just the mountain air getting thinner. It was a localized, bone-deep chill that made my breath come out in jagged, crystalline puffs. The trail began to narrow, the forest floor disappearing under a carpet of rotting leaves that smelled of copper and old, wet fur. That's when I saw the first one. It was a small bundle of sticks and bone, tied together with what looked like dirty twine, hanging from a low-hanging hemlock branch. Then another, and another. They swayed in a wind I couldn't feel, clicking softly like teeth. I pushed past them, my skin crawling with the sensation of 1,000 invisible eyes tracking my movement. I told myself it was just some local kids playing Blair Witch, but the precision of the knots and the way the bones were bleached a violent, unnatural white told a different story. I reached the overlook at Crag's End just as the moon broke through the clouds, casting a sickly silver light over the valley below. But the valley wasn't empty. Down in the hollow, far beneath the jagged ledge where I stood, a circle of lights was moving. They weren't flashlights or lanterns. They were soft, pulsing embers that drifted to the trees with a fluid, terrifying grace. They didn't bob like a person walking. They glided. I hunkered down behind a boulder, my breath hitching in my throat. From the depths of the hollow, a sound began to rise. It wasn't a scream and it wasn't a song. It was a rhythmic, low-frequency hum that vibrated in my very marrow, making my teeth ache and my vision blur. It sounded like the mountain itself was trying to speak through a throat filled with dirt. I tried to back away, moving an inch at a time so as not to kick any loose gravel, but the hum intensified. It started to form shapes in my mind, images of deep, sunless caverns and things that had been forgotten by the sun long before man learned to walk upright. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to walk toward the lights, to let go of the ledge and simply drift down into that warm, pulsing glow. My foot slid toward the precipice, my mind feeling like it was being scrubbed clean with sandpaper. Only the sharp sting of a briar catching my palm snapped me back to reality. I looked down and saw my toes hanging over a 300-foot drop. I scrambled back, gasping for air, my face slick with a cold sweat that felt like oil. That's when the whistling started. It was high, melodic, and hideously human. It was coming from directly behind me. I didn't want to turn around. Every instinct I had, every ancestral memory buried in my DNA, told me that looking back would be the last thing I ever did. But the whistle was mocking me, mimicking the tune of a lullaby my mother used to sing when I was 5 years old. It was impossible. There was no way anyone out here could know that song. I forced my head to turn, my flashlight beam cutting a desperate arc through the dark. The light hit a pair of eyes. They weren't animal eyes. They were too wide, too
to set into a face that looked like stretched parchment. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to have too many joints. It stood just beyond the circle of my light, swaying in time with that horrific whistling. I didn't think, I ran. I abandoned the trail, plunging headlong into the thicket, the branches clawing at my face and tearing my clothes. I could hear it behind me. It wasn't running. It was moving through the brush with the sound of snapping dry wood, always staying exactly 10 feet behind me. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I saw that pale, elongated face hovering in the darkness, its mouth stitched shut with the same dirty twine I'd seen on the bone charms. I crashed through a creek, the freezing water numbing my legs, and scrambled up the muddy bank on the other side. My lungs were burning, each breath feeling like I was swallowing broken glass. I found a small crevice between two massive boulders and shoved myself inside, pressing my back against the cold stone and praying to a god I hadn't spoken to in years. I turned off my flashlight. The darkness was absolute. I could hear my own blood rushing in my ears, a frantic rhythmic thudding. Then the scratching started. It was the sound of long, hard fingernails dragging across the surface of the boulders. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It was circling the rocks, testing the gaps. A long gray finger, tipped with a yellowed claw, poked through a crack just inches from my eyes. It wiggled blindly, searching for skin. I pulled my knees to my chest, biting my tongue so hard I tasted salt, forcing myself to stay perfectly still. The creature began to whisper. It didn't use its own voice. It used mine. I should have listened, it whispered in my exact tone, the words dripping with a wet, mocking cadence. I should never have come here. Hours passed in that stone tomb. The creature never left. It sat on top of the boulders, its heavy, uneven breathing vibrating through the rock. It told me things, secrets about my family, things I'd forgotten, things I hadn't even admitted to myself. It promised me that if I just came out, the hum would stop. It promised me that the mountains would keep me safe in the dark places where the sun couldn't reach. I kept my eyes shut tight, repeating a single mantra in my head. It isn't real. It isn't real. It isn't real. But the smell of decay and the freezing touch of the mountain air told me otherwise. It was the longest night of my life, a descent into a private purgatory where time ceased to have any meaning. When the first gray light of dawn finally began to bleed into the sky, the weight on the rocks disappeared. There was no sound of it leaving, no footsteps retreating into the woods. It was just gone. I waited another hour, paralyzed by the fear that it was a trick, before I finally crawled out of the crevice. My clothes were rags, my skin was mapped with deep scratches, and my hair had turned a shock of light at the temples. I didn't look for the trail. I simply headed downhill, stumbling through the laurel thickets until I hit a fire road. I didn't stop until I saw the headlights of a ranger's truck. He looked at me like he'd seen a ghost, and in a way, I suppose he had. I don't go near the woods anymore. I moved to the city, where the lights are bright and the noise never stops. But sometimes, when the wind hits the skyscrapers just right, I hear that high, melodic whistle. I look into the shadows of my hallway, and for a split second,
see a pale, jointed limb retreating around a corner. They say the Appalachians are the oldest mountains in the world, and now I know why people stay out of them at night. There are things there that remember the world before us, things that are hungry for the stories we tell ourselves to feel brave. I was lucky. I got out, but part of me is still in that crevice, listening to my own voice whisper back to me from the dark. The smell of the trail didn't change until I hit the 6-mile marker, deep in the guts of the Cherokee National Forest. Up until then, it was the standard perfume of the high country, crushed pine needles, damp earth, and the faint, sweet decay of autumn. But as the moon dipped behind a jagged ridge, leaving me in a world of charcoal shadows, the air turned sour. It was the scent of a stagnant pond mixed with something metallic, like a penny held under a tongue. I stopped, the beam of my high-intensity LED light cutting a violent white hole in the darkness. The trail ahead simply vanished, not because it ended, but because the forest had grown so aggressive, so thick with intertwining briars and blackened vines, that it looked like the woods were trying to stitch themselves shut. I checked my watch. 3:15 a.m., the hour of the wolf. I should have turned around when the birds went silent 3 miles back. In the Appalachians, silence is a physical weight. It's not the absence of noise, it's the presence of something waiting for you to make some. I took a step forward, and the ground felt wrong, too soft, like walking on a mattress. I looked down and realized I wasn't stepping on dirt anymore. I was walking on a carpet of dead moths, thousands of them, their dusty gray wings forming a literal path of scales and husks. They didn't crunch, they hissed under my boots. A cold shiver, the kind that starts at the base of the tailbone and vibrates up to the skull, took hold of me. I looked up, and that's when I saw the cabin. It wasn't on any map. It shouldn't have been there. It was built of crooked, unpeeled logs that seemed to lean away from the mountain, and every single window was covered in thick, bubbling black tar. There was no door handle, only a heavy iron ring. I found myself walking toward it, my legs moving with a heavy, leaden autonomy. It felt as if the cabin were inhaling, pulling the very air out of my lungs and dragging me towards its threshold. I reached out, my fingers trembling as they brushed the gold iron, and the ring turned on its own. The door groaned open, revealing a darkness so absolute it seemed to push back against my flashlight. I stepped inside, the floorboards screaming under my weight. The air inside was hot, feverish and wet. I panned my light around the room. It was empty of furniture, but the walls were covered in hair. Long gray strands of human hair were woven into the wood, cascading from the ceiling like weeping willow tree branches. I tried to scream, but the sound died in my throat as a voice drifted down from the rafters. It wasn't a voice I recognized, yet it spoke with the cadence of my grandfather, who had been buried 10 years prior. It whispered my name, drawn out into a long, wet sigh that ended in a clicking sound. I turned to run, but the door was gone. Not closed, not locked, simply gone. Where the frame had been, there was now only the seamless, hair-covered wall. The room began to shrink. I could hear the logs grinding against each other, the sound of wood splintering like bone. I dropped to my knees, clawing at the hair on the walls, trying to find the wood beneath, but my fingers only met warm, pulsing skin. The cabin wasn't a building, it was a throat, and I was being swallowed. The floor began to tilt, sliding me toward the center of the room, where a jagged hole had opened up. I shone my light down into the deck, and for a second I saw them, hundreds of hikers, all standing perfectly still in a vast subterranean chamber. They were dressed in North Face jackets and hiking boots, their backpacks still strapped to their shoulders, but their faces were gone. In their place
were smooth, featureless masks of pale flesh. They all looked up at once, their lack of eyes somehow more piercing than any stare I'd ever felt. The humming started again, that low-frequency vibration that made my brain feel like it was melting inside my skull. I realized then that the Appalachian trails weren't paths for us to walk, they were veins, and we were the blood meant to keep the mountain alive. I woke up at dawn, lying face down in the middle of the trailhead parking lot. My car was exactly where I'd left it, but when I looked in the rearview mirror, I didn't recognize the person looking back. My eyes were bloodshot, the irises turned a pale, sickly yellow, and when I opened my mouth to breathe, a single gray moth fluttered out from between my lips. I drove home in a trance, the heater on full blast even though the morning was warm. Every time I pass a wooded area now, I have to keep my windows rolled up. I can hear them calling from the tray line, a chorus of voices using the names of people I've lost, promising me that the hair-lined room is still waiting and that the mountain never truly lets go of what it has tasted. If you felt the hair stand up on the back of your neck during this journey into the dark heart of the mountains, show your support by hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel. We bring you the most chilling tales from the edge of reality every week, and you don't want to be left behind in the dark. Leave a comment below if you've ever felt like the woods were watching you, and remember to share this story with someone who thinks it's safe to hike after the sun goes down. Stay alert, keep your flashlight close, and we'll see you in the next terrifying episode.